everybody. Well, thanks for coming today. Looks like there's a lot of sessions, pretty busy. I'm glad you came to mine. So today I'm going to be talking a lot about how I've adapted a process that worked really well in news with the New York Times, and that was specifically for more exploratory visualizations, and how I've adapted it for product experiences, specifically in mobile, which is a really different beast when you're visualizing data. So I work at Fitbit, and just quickly I'm going to recap how I got into data visualization in the first place. I actually, when I started out as a student, I really wanted to get into 3D. I really wanted to do, I saw the Matrix and I was like, that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. So I had this realization though in school was that to actually do that, you need to be able to draw. So I went to art school, studied printmaking and drawing for a couple of years. And a couple of years later, I realized I actually can't draw. This isn't actually always a skill you can just acquire by doing more of it. So that was kind of painful. So I left art school. But I did discover one other thing, and that was that it's actually a lot easier when math draws for you, at least for me. And I fell into this crazy world of data visualization and generative art by people like Jared Tarbell, Casey Reyes, Joshua Davis, just really wild generative stuff. And when I saw this work, I was just like, this was me. I was like, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. This is my new rest of the life thing that I'm going to do. I was totally hooked. Of course, it's kind of tough to be an artist and a coder. Not a lot of work, at least back then. Eventually, I stuck on storytelling and I ended up at the New York Times. And I ended up in the graphics department in a really interesting time. It was the 2007 election cycle. So here was a new amazing to me. Here, visualization and graphics had a really natural home alongside massive stories. I was able to see graphics carry entire stories and deliver huge impact. And this is where I became really deeply passionate about visualization as a narrative tool and as a way to communicate. And ultimately, I think it really still drives the process that I use now when I'm designing products. And the kinds of stories we would tell in graphics would really vary. Sometimes it was more of a data-driven view for elections, tracking swing states. Sometimes it was tracking detainees held in Guantanamo. Other times it was breaking news stories like Hurricane Sandy in New York, destroying homes on Long Island. And behind all these, there's actually really different timescales for the kind of work you would do. Like this would be maybe a day or two, whereas previous graphics would be maybe a couple weeks, or something like Snowfall. This was a long-form story that had sort of visualizations accompanying the text. And this was a really different role for graphics. Really here was just more of a device that helped guide the story. And to be clear, I don't think that pretty snow is a visualization. That's just a film clip from it. Anyway, ultimately that led me to this conclusion that is really important in news, and that is that you need to be able to write the headline first. So what exactly do I mean by writing the headline? I mean, that's the text above the graphic. It's a piece of the story that can communicate without the graphic itself. It's what people are going to tweet. It's what people are going to talk about. The headline describes the content of the visual form you've arrived at. Without the headline, it's just a line graph. But when they join forces, they immediately lower the cognition barrier. The headline really is the hook. It pulls you in, it sets expectations about what you're looking at. It also allows you to get away with really beautiful stuff like this. And most importantly, it forces you to edit down and figure out what the story actually is first. It really forces you to have a perspective on what's important. Oftentimes you'll end up with a lot of data and a lot of different things you're trying to say in a graphic. And there's this, as a visualization designer, you kind of want to cram it all often in one place. But if you write the headline first, you're able to decide and determine what's important first. It also puts you in a really strong position when you walk up to your editor, at least in a news setting, with this incredible idea that you've been working on and how it's going to have huge impact on everybody who sees it. So this is still from All the President's Men, so the classic journalism newsroom setting. That mean old guy there on the right, he's an editor. Reporters, he's the executive editor. So you'd approach this editor with a glimmer in your eye, all excited about this amazing idea, this graphic that you just sprung from your brilliance. And this person would look at your sketch, take a really deep breath, and he would say something like this: "Why should I care? Why should I care about this crazy graphic you're showing me?" And he's not just referring to himself, he's referring to a reader's perspective. Why should I stop what I'm doing and actually look at this thing? So, really what I'm trying to say here is that editors are professional skeptics, and I'd encourage the data visualization designers to take up that critical perspective, to become a skeptic about what you're showing people. The editor is demanding because he knows a reader's patience is limited. He grinds down visual flourish because even though he knows readers may appreciate it and appreciate pretty looking graphics, he understands the deeper moments of clarity and insight resonate a lot longer. Lots of people saw this. This especially, I think, communicates my point. This was a visualization in Pop Sci about Hiroshima nuclear explosions. And when you look at what the artist said about this work, and it became a little controversial at the time, of course, and he said, "I wanted the work to highlight not just the dropping of the atom bomb, but the factors leading up to the event itself, and the countries involved in the process." So for me, I don't see that there. But I do see a really beautiful thing I might print on a band t-shirt. And don't get me wrong, aesthetically, I love it. But in some ways, it's really insensitive to the topic, and it doesn't really communicate a whole lot. A really different take from the Times from a long, long time ago. This is putting the combat deaths from 3 different conflicts in perspective. World War II, Vietnam, Iraq. This came out right during the time when there was just a lot of protests and anger about what was happening in Iraq. So this graphic is the product of thinking deeply about context and relationships. It's about writing the headline first. It's not about visual forms. This is a bar chart. But it's a lot more powerful, I would argue. And it's the result of arriving at an opinion about what matters. An opinion, not necessarily, in a news context, opinion is a little bit troublesome. But here I'm talking about opinion like, what is the design perspective on what people want to know about this? So really, it's not enough to just show a viz and expect someone to get it or to care. You have to have a really potent message and an opinion about what's interesting. And so typically in a news setting, the way you would do that is you would follow a pretty typical data viz process. And when I say typical, I mean take a static data set, analyze it, sketch some forms, refine, and then publish out into the world, gather the tweets and bask in its glory. So for an example of how when I first left news and I came into more of a product role at Strava, this was 2 or 3 years ago. I'm going to use an example from race results from a marathon. This is a really good candidate for visualization because there's a lot of data, and when there's a lot of it and it's pretty granular, you can probably do something pretty interesting with it, of course. We've got finish times, profile info, detailed second-by-second GPS data. So I think there's potentially a candidate for an interesting product. So we do sort of the obligatory analysis here. Take a really wide-angle lens and make a basic histogram. We're looking at finish times. I see these kind of interesting spikes, around the hour and half-hour marks. So to me, that kind of looks like people have cutoff times that they're shooting for. That's kind of interesting. So then maybe we look at pace. Let's look at pace per mile. This is every runner that I was able to gather data from the Boston Marathon. You see these sort of undulating waves, kind of fun. You also see this nice little separation. So to me, that says they're getting more tired at the end. You also see these big humps. It seems like you're kind of getting this contour of the entire race, which is kind of fun. And when we actually look at the elevation profile, we see that Heartbreak Hill is where that biggest undulation is. But pace is really tough to work on. There's a lot of variability. It's hard to describe change exactly because you were talking about typically who finished first. So let's try a little bump map or a bump chart, sorting by rank. Obviously, this is like totally, you can't read it, but I kind of see the beginnings of something interesting with these little dives up and down. So let's highlight the top third. And we see all the fast people, like pretty consistent, right? See these little outliers, that's kind of fun. I wonder what's going on there. Pretty conservative start. Maybe they went to the bathroom. Then we highlight the bottom third. And you just see all this separation. And I'm like, well, that's kind of cool. So, at this point in an explanatory or like a new setting, we've got kind of enough to start experimenting and sketching. And I don't exactly have a narrative or a story here, but what I do have is kind of the beginnings, enough to get sketching and started. So I end up with something like this. This is a product of like 2 or 3 days of sketching with that data. You can select the people at the top for what, in that histogram when they finished, takes the runners, and then I can compare their rank over time. I'm not sure if you can see it because it's so blown out there. So there's kind of like a compelling potential for an interesting idea here. I can compare how I finished with the people around me. Like, did they come up from behind, or were they crashing and burning? I mean, what happened? The unfortunate realization I had after doing this project was that exploratory data visualization is for me as the developer designer, and it's not really for your users. It doesn't scale the product experiences because it doesn't put the user's needs first. It makes them do a ton of work, and we really need to avoid that, especially when we're talking about a mobile context. So we're going to tweak that typical data viz process a little bit more, and we're going to talk about adding research and user testing to the front and the end of it. So at Fitbit, what we're going to do is we're going to analyze this data, come up with some sketches, and then ultimately we're going to test that opinion with respective groups to evaluate our hypothesis. It's tricky designing visualizations on mobile. We're dealing with a really different kind of reader. If you think about how you use your phone, you've been conditioned for speed, for utility, not depth. Mobile is just all about getting in, getting out as fast as possible. You look at Twitter and Facebook, you can jump between those apps in less than a minute and feel like you got something. So that's kind of the reality that you're dealing with when you're visualizing on mobile. And then we talk about Fitbit, we talk about screens like this. Well, now there's no evidence, there's no deep analysis about what we're dealing with here. It's entirely utility. So, if we design a data-rich experience, we'll start with, at Fitbit at least, we start with the real data first and decide from there what comparisons we want to make or trends we want to surface. And the reason we start with the data first is because we're kind of dealing with this problem. I mean, I'm a designer, but I would call it the designer ideal. And that typically looks like this. Here's a heart rate chart, simple little line graph. This is the thing that got signed off on before we put it in the app. I didn't do this, but I think this is typically what you're going to do if you give a designer Sketch or Photoshop and they say, hey, do a data visualization design. They're going to end up with this beautiful line like this. It's going to actually look like this. It's going to look terrible. And so my job as a data visualization designer is to get in with the data first and try to make mistakes and inform the design sooner rather than later. So a good example of where we did that was this new product called sedentary time at Fitbit. The goals around sedentary time was that it had to work on Fitbit devices. So whatever form or abstraction we come up with has to work on a potentially black and white display. It needs to be really, really positive. Fitbit's all about, motivating you. Sadly, with sedentary time, like you're all sitting stationary, you're all dying slowly in front of me. So we want to celebrate success to get you out of your chair. So we get sketching. We've got the algorithm basically worked out. We start sketching with some of this data just to see what we've got. Along X, I've got minutes. On Y, I've got hours. And it's color-coded by sedentary and active time. So I'm guessing that this is me asleep. This is me awake. So that's just like a basic like summary stat version of visualizing some data. But it's super boring, right? So we started playing around with the idea of just visualizing sedentary time, taking out all the active time. So this is cumulative periods of sitting still. It's kind of interesting. It's also people felt it was super negative. What I should have prefaced this with is that we gather all Fitbit users' data in the company, or at least those that agree to, and we subject them to these terrible design sketches on a regular basis. So if we're designing a product and you work at Fitbit, you're going to be getting emails and designs like this in your inbox and people coming around haranguing you, like me, to tell me what you think about this. So people felt this was kind of negative. They didn't want to know how long they hadn't been doing anything. They wanted to know when they had been doing something. Metabolism, another sort of proxy into active versus sedentary time. So we had this notion that if you were active enough during an hour, maybe not consecutive minutes, but enough during the course of an hour, maybe we give you a star. So it's kind of cool. I call this Joy Division chart. Kind of reminded me of the album cover. But it's also pretty analytical and kind of boring. So on this idea about metabolism, we start playing around with like, hey, let's take all these periods of time, turn them into little bubbles, and visualize them all. Like this will work fairly well on a mobile screen. Highlight like active periods. And then if we want to have a little bit more fun with it, what if these active moments sort of ate up all the sedentary moments? So make them a little hungry, make them a little crazy. So when I walked around and asked people what they thought about this, they were like, it's creepy. I am scared of those bubbles, and I don't want to see this on a regular basis. So we scrapped that. I was like, this is it. This is going to be my mark on the Fitbit design experience. But no, it didn't happen. So we focused back on time and positivity, back on stars. Everyone loves getting stars. Circle is not so great, obviously, because we're dealing with variable hours in the day. So we went to half circle. And so at the end of this, what I'm not actually showing is the many Google forms and questions and emails that I'm sending people. But in order to find out what actually resonates with people, we've got to test it. We've got to ask them how they feel and what they felt before and after. These were the findings from testing. And this is the ultimate end result. It's not a crazy complicated visualization. I know many of the people here are used to dealing with huge data sets. And we're dealing with huge data sets, but we're not trying to tell users that we are. And on mobile, we're dealing with abstractions. Since we have so few pixels, I think the one failing of this form is that it doesn't work so great in this kind of format. So, in some ways, we have to adapt, and hopefully we can iterate on it. So anyway, that's what I've got for visualizing health data. Thanks for having me.
And we have time for one question.
So thanks for your presentation. So what you're showing on the screen, a lot of those were full computer programs. That's not just a chart with a little action on the mouse over.
Right.
So, but you didn't say anything about method or mechanics or current programming languages or anything like
Yeah, so we're D3, a web page. Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, these examples I was showing, these data sketches, don't maybe seem as much like data sketches. They look like a lot of work. Is that basically what?
It's a computer program
Right.
you're executing.
Right. So I think in this case, you have to embrace the ugliness and have to embrace the fact that the code that you write for these visualizations are complete throwaway. You're not trying to scale or write complex abstractions or systems. These are sketches in the truest form, like paper on napkin, embarrassing, don't let anyone ever see that you wrote this stuff. Just JavaScript and HTML. So, yeah. Oh. Hi.
I just want to quickly know, for that project, for the active hours, how much time do you spend in each step?
So per hour, 250 steps would be considered at least.
No, I mean from research.
Oh, I see. Those data sketches, I usually wouldn't spend more than a couple days per data sketch. And so I think the entire like product as a whole, a couple months to maybe like 3/4 of a year. So. Sorry?
Let me stop that recording.
Oh, okay.
All right, thank you very much, Noah.